Bread, the staff of life. Historically, it goes back, about 14,000 years, as we learned from this paper right here. Somewhere in present-day Jordan, they found remnants of bread. Now, in those days, it would have been flat bread. They would have ground up some grain and moistened it with water and baked it. Today, however, of course, we have leavened bread, and that's where things become interesting. Sourdough bread, great bread. Turns out that probably sometime about 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, someone left some ground grain that had been moistened sitting around a while, and they discovered that it started to rise up. There were bubbles in that primitive dough. The Egyptians were aware of this, and they recorded it. They were the first ones to record it. Leavened bread. What happened? Well, it turns out that if you take ground grains, ground wheat, for example, and you moisten it, the bacteria and the yeasts that are naturally present in that grain will start to multiply. And they will absorb some of the sugars that are naturally present in the grain and convert it into carbon dioxide, alcohol, and various acids. And of course, it is the carbon dioxide that makes the bread rise. Why is it called sourdough? Because the acids that also form taste sour. So the Egyptians had sourdough bread. Today, there are all kinds of sourdough breads that are available. Why? Because there are all kinds of bacteria and yeasts out there, both present in grains naturally and floating around in the air. So if you just take some grains and moisten it and let it sit for a while, it will also absorb some of these microbes from the air, and what we have is a starter, a sourdough starter. And these starters will give rise to different tastes of sourdough bread because it depends on exactly which kind of microbes are present. It's a fascinating business. Now, interestingly enough, it turns out that the baker's hands play a role in modern day sourdough. And again, this we now know because of this fascinating study. Researchers sent samples of the same wheat to bakers around the world, and they were instructed on how to make a sourdough starter from the same batch of wheat. And then they would send back the sourdough starter that they made for analysis. And it turned out that they had different bacteria, different yeasts. Why? Because some of those came from the hands of the bakers. When they were kneading the dough, they would transfer some of their bacteria and some of the yeast on their skin, and we all have this, even if you wash your hands, into the bread. And that's why there are so many different sourdough breads in the world. If you go to San Francisco, probably have the best sourdough bread because they have a specific bacterium that is present in the air there that isn't present in most other places. But in Montreal, we may have a different set of bacteria in the air and yeast. So our sourdough bread would taste different. I'm very particular about the bread that I eat, and I found some very, very good sourdoughs. And I think it is because we have some bakers here who have just the right kind of microbes on their hands. So we have come a long way from the ancient Egyptians, who were the first ones to describe the making of what we would call sourdough bread. And thank goodness today we have a great variety thanks to all of those yeasts and all of those microbes that are floating around and get into the bread. Quite different from the usual supermarket loaf, which is just made with baker's yeast. No excitement there. But take a bite out of a good sourdough bread and your taste buds will frolic.